Railway Conversations with Doc Frank.
Hello and welcome to Railway Conversations with me, Doc Frank. This podcast is there to present you authentic, unrehearsed discussions with interesting guests about railway topics that matter. Thank you for listening. My guest today is Craig Sparrius from Melbourne in Australia. Craig has substantial experience in network planning and timetable planning for the railway systems in Melbourne and Sydney. And since 2015, he's running his own business that's focused on those planning activities as well as on modeling to underfeed the planning activities. Accordingly, our conversation is a lot about planning, what can be done for higher capacity, what are ways to compromise higher capacity. So we're talking about mixed traffic, we're talking about network design. I'm pretty sure you will enjoy it. And in fact, I personally enjoyed it so much, and there was so much more to talk about with Craig that I'm all but committed to a follow-up episode in the near future. With that said, please enjoy today's part of the conversation. If you are a fan of communications-based train control or short CBTC, there's an event coming up in September that you absolutely don't want to miss. It's the first virtual global CBTC conference. It's called CBTC World Summit 2023, and it's happening on the 20th and the 21st of September. There will be 3 sessions of about 6 hours duration each for 3 different global regions, one for Asia Pacific, one's for North and South America, and one's for Europe and the Middle East. So wherever you are in the world, one of those sessions will be during the daytime in your time zone, and you can watch it live for the full 6 hours with 6 presentations. The kicker about this is that all other presentations, including the ones from your own session, will be available for replay via recordings. So that means that if the other session should be in the middle of your night, you can still watch it on demand at a time that's more convenient for you and doesn't interfere with your good night's sleep. The conference is available for registration right now at my training portal under docfranktraining.podia.com/summit23. I repeat that, docfranktraining.podia.com/summit23. I'm putting a lot of effort into this conference. It will be an absolute blockbuster event, and I very much hope to see you there. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Doc Frank. Looking forward to
it. We've known each other for a while. We were in touch on a couple of projects in Melbourne, one of them being the Metro Tunnel. So you have quite a strong position in the industry when it comes to operational planning for railways, including timetable planning, including capacity planning. Just give us a bit of a background where you've come from, how you developed your career, and how you ended up founding your own company in that space, please.
Sure, can do. I actually applied for the Victorian Public Service Scheme, and the Public Transport Corporation, as it was then, was one of the entities seeking graduates, and I was successfully applied into a graduate position in the Public Transport Corporation back in 1996. At that time, it wasn't a very big growing industry. It was being broken up and set up for privatisation. So as a graduate, I went through those early years where the Melbourne and Victorian system became privatised, and different private operators came in to operate the system. Through the first few years, there was a big project called Jolimont Rationalisation Project, which decentralised a lot of Melbourne's train operations. Several years later, I applied for and successfully had the job of timetable manager for the suburban and V-line system. That was a fantastic job. It led a team of 20 to 30 people, planning the timetables for Melbourne and Victoria. Through those years, about 3 years, I got to know the system. I wouldn't have said that I understood the system that well when I first got the job, but made some timetable changes with the team for things like the electrification out to water gardens and some different routing around North Melbourne. Through the next few years, I then shifted to the Victorian department and wanted to get more involved in rail strategy rather than just working on timetables. Through the next 5 to 10 years, I did a range of roles, some bids, both in Australia and overseas, in New Zealand and in America, and then came back and worked for Metro Trains, again as timetable manager. I was then headhunted and applied for a job in New South Wales and became the planning manager in New South Wales for the department, which had just taken on the role of detailed timetable design from Railcorp. At the same time, Railcorp was being split up into 2 entities, Sydney Trains and New South Wales Trains. So this is a different setup of industry whereby the detailed timetable was not with the operator or the access provider. It was put inside the department. So I led the team there, and there was a major timetable introduction in 2013, which actually took about 3 years to plan and implement. That included a big program called Clearways in New South Wales, a lot of infrastructure changes that made the network easier to operate and more resilient, and also the introduction of a couple of big train types, the Waratah trains, which is now the predominant train in suburban Sydney, and the Oscar trains in New South Wales Trains. After being in New South Wales for 3-4 years, I actually came back and started up my own company, which continues to run to this day. And I started work on Metro Tunnel project where we met. Since that time, my company and myself have been engaged on most of Victoria's big rail projects, be it Melbourne Tunnel Project, Suburban Rail Loop, level crossing removals, Melbourne Airport Rail, and a number of others more recently, like Melton line capacity upgrade. In the last few years, I've had some employees, and I've worked with them on things like detailed modelling to help refine project scope and rail strategy for departments, authorities, or technical advisors. I think that about sums it up.
The last thing you said was really resonated with me, where you basically said you did some modeling, or you tend to do modeling that basically feed into strategies, into scoping decisions for projects, and that's very much what I've done in my own practice as well. For example, when I did the planning for high capacity signaling in Perth, I didn't just come up with some target figure where I said, okay, well, this is what other cities are doing. I wanted to know specifically whether this is something that's achievable on the specific network in Perth, on the suburban network there. And I did it through modeling. So I got a modeler on board. We were using existing network models that the PTA already had in place. We tweaked that network model with modern signaling technologies that we thought of introducing. CBTC which is a moving block technology. And then we were modeling that we can achieve the target capacity, or we established how much capacity we can achieve on each and every line of the network. And that was, as you said, that was before we put those capacity targets out in the open, before we wrote it in the business case, before we went out advertising the project and basically seeking funding from the government and all that. So I'm very much aligned with you that this should be a very early activity in the project, basically testing hypotheses and getting more certainty around the actual requirements or the actual targets that you're setting for either a strategy or for a business case for a project or something like that. Is that, in your experience, something which is really done by stakeholders with some kind of discipline, or have you been in situations where people went the other way, like putting out the targets first and then suddenly say, wait a minute, can we actually achieve those?
I've definitely involved in those projects where requirements or project goals up front have either been not defined to any great extent or poorly defined or defined very loosely without much detail. And what it can lead to, Dr. Frank, is confusion with the project scope. It can lead to blowouts in terms of budgets because the scope wasn't clear. And if it's carried through to the market, it can lead to very big variations because the market can quite simply say, no, that wasn't a requirement. So it is key to define project goals and cascade them down to measurable requirements. And in between, you often have these compromises with service structure. So person A might say, we'd like trains to go at 42 minutes from location A to B. Person B might say, we'd like trains to operate at 95% on time in peaks. Now, the two may or may not be compatible and compromises might have to be made. So capacity is certainly a key one, Doc Frank, particularly in markets like Melbourne and Sydney that are growing between 70,000 and 120,000 people per year. So both those cities are growing and they're definitely seeking capacity, which can be done through either more trains or longer trains or things like new lines. But then there's other goals that other projects have, like we want fast trains, which is always a political aspiration and sounds exciting to have fast trains. But again, I think the important thing is to start with a clear scope. What do you want to achieve out of your rail system? Because quite simply, metro trains should be seeking for different things and different design goals and requirements than a long-distance regional operator or a high-speed system or a freight network. And areas like Melbourne and Sydney have to wrestle with the legacies of what the railways have been for 150 years. They not only have suburban trains, which are trying to seek more and more capacity consistent with metros, but they have long-distance suburban commutes, which often want things like seats. They have regional trains on the same tracks often, because it would cost a huge amount to have dedicated regional lines. And they operate freight trains through suburban networks and regional networks. So there's a number of key challenges the projects are trying to wrestle with, which does make it hard to clarify the goals of the project and the detailed requirements of the project through the early life cycles of projects.
Yes, well, that's a very good point. I think it's a traditional problem of railways that people think we have a railway track there, so that means anything railway can run on those tracks in order to utilize them. Why would we have to build a new track or an additional track if we can use the existing one? And historically, that wasn't really a problem. That you have some, for example, as you said, suburban services running predominantly on a part of the network on a certain railway line, but then also having some regional services running on the same line, and then the odd freight train also running on the same tracks. I think there was a time in Melbourne where people put a lot of effort into separating those networks. I'm thinking of the regional rail link, which was a major separation of networks in the west of Melbourne predominantly. But at the same time, you still have lines with mixed traffic, and two of them in the case of Melbourne being the Dandenong line and the Sunbury line, which now unfortunately are those two lines which will be connected with the new metro tunnel in the middle. So what you basically have there is a situation where you try to implement some high capacity new part of the network in the middle between two lines where capacity is severely impacted by these mixed traffic conditions. So I really struggle to develop a kind of question here. Maybe I should just be quiet and let you talk to that or on that. What can possibly be done in those scenarios to, well, improve things, like improve capacity, or whether you just say doesn't really work very well?
It is a challenge. The corridor you mentioned, of course, has a number of complex junctions. places like Westall and Dandenong and Sunshine. And with a range of different trains seeking a range of different routes, it's very hard to change that corridor into a simple design. Often railways work well when design is simple.
Yes.
Metro in some of the most common cities in the world are what we call up and down lines, back and forth. And sometimes the trickiest thing they do is turn around a train in a terminal with a couple of crossovers. And a separate crossover might take them to a stabling and maintenance yard. Now, that's very different from the sort of railway that Melbourne and Victoria has, and even Sydney and New South Wales. Probably New South Wales has gone a bit further with separation, with things like the Southern Sydney Freight Line, but they have also put in some passing loops for freight trains. And in the suburban network, they've put in additional platforms or quite a few more grade separation rail to rail. So Victoria, of course, is motoring ahead with grade separation between road and rail. But there are a number of flat junctions and single lines that still make the suburban network, let alone the regional network, quite challenging to timetable and operate. Now, no one thinks they're going to be gone overnight. And there is a continuous challenge to match in the requirements and best design aspects of a suburban system together with a regional network and continue to allow freight trains to operate. And ideally, in a policy sense, a lot of people would love more freight trains on the network to allow less trucks on the roads, particularly in pressure places like the inner west in Melbourne, where trucks are going through residential streets. So people would love more freight on rail, but it needs a holistic solution from ports to intermodal terminals, and it needs windows of operation that it can operate through the suburban network in particular. And that becomes a key challenge against the growing need for suburban trains and longer peak hours of operation, where there simply isn't paths for freight trains.
Mm. Mm. Yes, you mentioned the junctions and the connectivity of lines on the Melbourne network, which is I'm not sure whether it's so much better in Sydney, but I think Sydney at least seems to put more emphasis on separating the services, because I think, and maybe because that's one of the lessons learned from Sydney Metro, which is that typical up and down operation that you mentioned, where the most complex thing is the turnback at the end. Maybe it's some influence from there as well, that people in Sydney say, well, if we can really segregate the corridors, at least operationally, so not necessarily ripping out all the turnovers, all the crossovers, which basically removes any kind of operational flexibility that we may ever want or need. But in normal operation, especially in peak traffic, if we can just separate those corridors and having a clearer up and down services where one corridor is going like this and the other corridor is going like this, but it's not going this every 5 minutes. It just separated. That helps the reliability of our operation. So trains can be run more punctual. It's easier to operate. There are less things that can go wrong. Now, Melbourne, interestingly, had such a strategy as well. And you probably have seen that document that came out back in 2012. Maybe you even worked on that in your professional past, I don't know. The network development plan, which was actually mentioning to develop the Melbourne network into a metro-style operation, into a metro-style service. And they listed a number of criteria what they define as a metro-style service. And one of the things was a segregation of the lines, of the corridors in the network, and to operate those corridors as standalone lines. Now, 10 years, looking 10 years into the future, which is basically today, this strategy seems to have failed, or appears to have failed, because this segregation is not happening. As you said, there's a lot of segregation between the road network and the rail network, which is everything about level crossing removals. But the segregation of rail corridors hasn't really happened. Maybe because it wasn't seen as important enough, or maybe it was seen as being too expensive, because once you separate the corridors, you also need dedicated train depots on each corridor, on each line. And I assume from the outside, looking at Melbourne from a distance, I assume that was really the breaking point, where the government says, well, wait a minute, we only have a limited budget for transport. We are struggling at the moment to keep all the major projects running that we have set up, that we want to do. And one consequence is the Melbourne Airport Rail being on hold now for the time being. We can't afford like building train depots, additional train depots on various lines just for the sake of segregating the lines. So you are obviously an insider in the Melbourne market, having worked on all these major infrastructure projects. Would you kind of go along with this? Do you think I have kind of analyzed this correctly?
Definitely some key points there, Doc Frank. One of the things I want to touch on that you mentioned is the extent to which Melbourne is or isn't a decentralised train network. So ideally in rail, because it takes a long time for some of the key projects, ideally there would be a long-term, even bipartisan agreed framework for where the rail networks are going to go, both the Melbourne and Victorian, not just the Melbourne. But questions like, is the network moving to a decentralised operation? And what I mean by that is things like maintenance and train stabling. Are they in the city or at the ends of lines? And there's a bit of a mix. When I first started in the railways, places like Epping train depot were set up, and that really decentralised. At the same time as Jolimont rationalisation got rid of a lot of the trains that used to sit outside Flinders Street. About 45 trains and a maintenance depot and train cleaners and shunters who used to manually move points all resided outside Flinders Street. It was a big centre of power. Now, that in some ways worked well because in the morning peaks when trains were finished, they'd just go a kilometre down the road and park. But not everyone thought looking at trains from Princes Bridge and Flinders Street was as beautiful as potentially I do. So there was further decentralisation. But again, that seems to have stopped. A lot of the inner area freight on the west yards were reconverted and repurposed to be suburban stabling, places like Melbourne Yard. So as the role of freight on rail went down, the opportunity was taken to use some of the freight areas and repurpose them. Because again, the alternative of setting up greenfield stabling sites and maintenance sites for the existing suburban system didn't really find a business case on an ongoing basis. So without that lack of a clear medium to long-term strategy, and I'm really talking about 10 to 30 year type window, the governments can commit to, it's very hard to shift a railway strategically across to something else. Remembering, of course, that Melbourne's first train ran in 1854. So it's not a modern metro. It can't just become a modern metro, but every design decision you make does take you somewhere. The network will be shaped by decisions that obviously got made right back from 1854, but also decisions that get made today, tomorrow, next week, etc. But ideally, a long-term strategy agreed by government and of both major parties would shift the railway forward with some key questions. I can't tell you if and when Geelong might be electrified. I can't tell you when an airport rail will be commissioned for Melbourne. I also can't tell you if there'll ever be, additional track amplification out to Dandenong. So all these sort of things are questions that ideally would be answered in a rail strategy that would help link in to land use planning and also logistics planning. Is rail really going to shift back with freight or not? Or is it going to continue to be an evolution to more and more trucks working across? And is Melbourne's port going to stay in its current location, or is Hastings going to become more important? So all these housing, logistics questions should be worked in with what do you want your rail system to do? I know what I'd like it to do. I'd like it to walk down the street and have a bus coming along, key arterials every 10 or 20 minutes of the day, knowing that I can get to the suburban station and not have to wait more than 10 minutes for most of the day. I'd love more frequency to be prioritised by government because I think it allows more modal choice. I like cars. I don't mind driving, but again, the rise of the arterials in Melbourne are really challenging because they just can't have the capacity. And it is ableist. It supports people that can drive. Not everyone can drive or not everyone wants to drive. So I'd love to see the rail system positively move forward, both with its projects, but also its service frequency, and ideally in a way where people can have a bit more clarity and clear understanding where the direction of the rail system and the wider public transport system is going to go for Melbourne, Victoria, and also the other jurisdictions across Australia.
Yeah, I mean, staying with the Melbourne example, simply because you have clearly the most of your professional experience is from Melbourne, from working in Melbourne and for projects in Melbourne. And I have spent a lot of time recently to look at the Melbourne strategy as well. And I basically have followed it ever since 2013 when I came across that strategy paper from Melbourne as part of the strategic considerations for Perth. There are certain, strategic visions that are put out there by the politicians. For example, more trains more often is one of the key mottos that's been brought up by politicians in Victoria, well, ever since the metro tunnel was conceived and basically funded and started. And I believe that whole concept of higher capacity in Melbourne, because of the ongoing growth of the city, the strong growth of the city, and the need for improved mobility, that's an ongoing theme. But it's certainly not enough to just put it out there as a label or as a thought bubble or as a soundbite. It needs to shape the strategy. And if I look critically at what was done at the Metro Tunnel project with all the high capacity ambitions for like a new high capacity signaling and a new high capacity type of trains, which is actually called high capacity metro train, HCMT, some of the things were successful. So I believe, for example, the HCMT is a fantastic train and it does have features that allow for higher capacity, for more passengers on the train, faster passenger exchange at stations, which also helps the capacity of the railway line, because if you can keep the dwell time at station shorter, then that helps reducing your headways and that increases your capacity of the railway. But other things, especially when it comes to signaling, were not really that successful. Yeah, so if you introduce a very expensive, compared to the old signaling, a very expensive new technology for high capacity signaling, but you can't really get practical increase of capacity out of the system, it's kind of pointless, and it must be very disappointing. And I can imagine looking forward on the future of strategy in Melbourne. You say, well, we still want higher capacity. We have to have higher capacity. A key constraint of the system is the signaling. So we're still committed, because we have to. We still are committed to high capacity signaling. So how do we introduce high capacity signaling that actually does a job, that actually increases capacity? And it's not just a fancy title, but then at the end of the day, you run as many trains with the new technology that you used to run beforehand. So how can you get there? Let's talk a bit about this.
Sure. In regard to what us insiders call the Dandenong to Sunshine Corridor, which is the linkage that you spoke about through Melbourne Tunnel Project of the train lines that go out through Dandenong through to Pakenham, Cranbourne as suburban lines. In the east, that actually extends all the way out to Bairnsdale with the V-line services. So they operate on the same corridor. Yes, they won't go into the Melbourne Tunnel Project, but they'll divert across and continue to go through towards Richmond, Flinders Street, and most likely Southern Cross at least some of the day. On the other side, to the west, it goes right through to the suburban terminal of Sunbury, but then through to Bendigo and right through to Echuca and Swan Hill. It's a very long corridor. So, of course, you're not going to introduce the same sort of high-capacity in-cab signalling all the way out to the extents. You're endeavouring to do it in the inner part of the suburban system where you really want to run a high-capacity system. But what you need to do is actually present to those boundaries in a reliable way and ideally feed in within the slots that high-capacity signalling can allow, which by logic are closer than conventional signalling can offer. So there's definitely an ability to maximise your usage of the train tracks within the area where the suburban trains will switch across and operate under high capacity signalling. Now, at this stage, that's not planned to apply for the V-line trains or the freight trains. So they'll continue to operate on conventional signalling inside trains that are operating on high capacity slots. So ideally, the boundaries to get change over to the high capacity signalling for suburban trains presents trains reliably on time. Now, freight trains will continue to not have pathways during the peaks. V-lines will. So there's one challenge, Doc Frank, is to ensure that the timetable and the reliable operation to the boundaries of high capacity signalling are well managed, planned, handed over. Trains don't have equipment failures to switch between conventional signalling and high capacity signalling. But then, of course, it shifts across. Ideally, you want consistency of timetable patterns in the area where you're maximising your usage of track, and you want sufficient recovery for your different types of trains. And then you shift across into a tunnel where there's going to be the majority of passenger movement. So no longer will the trains go through places like Richmond that have a lot of interchange, but they will be going through new stations at Town Hall and State Library that, again, will have a lot of interchange of passengers between Flinders Street and Melbourne Central. So the important thing is the design decisions taken not just for the signalling, but for things like the train, and you spoke about the high-capacity metro train, underpin and allow reliable capacity and optimise capacity. So on the high-capacity train, there'll be wider doors than we're used to with some of the existing rolling stock, Comengers, Siemens trains, which are different from the Comengers and the Extrapolis because they only had 2 doors per carriage. Yeah. So the high-capacity trains will be faster to unload and load the same amount of passengers as some of the prior trains that are operating in Melbourne prior to their introduction. So they are, of course, operating today through the what we call the Caulfield Loop. But once they switch across the Melbourne Tunnel, which hopefully is commissioned in the next 12 to 24 months, they'll be going through Melbourne's first platform screen door stations, being the 5 new stations that will be commissioned by the Melbourne Tunnel project. So that linkage between the rolling stock, the signalling and general operational practices, with this being planned as a GOA 2 system, really need to work in to optimise that reliable through capacity. Up at surface, prior to going through the eastern or western portal, of course, the V-line and off-peak freight trains will divert across with largely their existing routes. So it's working together between the different train types, which are doing different jobs. Clearly, a V-line train is not designed to stop at every suburban station and pick up and drop off like a suburban train is. But there'll be a movement towards a consistency of only high-capacity metro trains operating through this tunnel, and effectively only high-capacity metro trains operating all the way from Pakenham, Cranbourne, right through to West Footscray, Water Gardens and Sunbury. So there'll be a more consistent approach to the rolling stock. And I think some of the work practices out there in the Metro Trains network and even the V-Line network need to be just reviewed and tightened up in light of shifting across to high-capacity signalling operation underpinning the future network.
Yeah, and I think a very important point that you made is to basically look at this topic of capacity increase more holistically. Because if you just focus on a couple of things, but then the other things are not as they are needed to be to support the higher capacity, then that may ruin the whole thing. So one example is if you have a line where you not just have mixed traffic in terms of suburban trains and regional trains, you also have mixed traffic with regards to the suburban trains fitted with a new high-capacity signaling technology, the regional trains not being fitted. And you have a third aspect, if you will, of mixed traffic, which is suburban trains that are supposed to stop at every station, the so-called all-stoppers, suburban trains which are supposed to skip a few stations, and they often are called greatly semi-express or something like that. And then you have regional services coming from far outside Melbourne going into the city center, and ideally they're not supposed to stop at all. Yeah, so they are supposed to be express trains pretty much all the way on the same suburban tracks where all the other trains are stopping pretty much every few hundred meters. So And another thing that that's a problem that needs to be dealt with. And I think one way of going away with it is to replicate what's happening on real high capacity networks. So if I, for instance, take Sydney Metro as the only genuine metro operation we currently have in Australia, their capacity is nowhere near what it can be for the time being because you don't have the patronage demand, but that's a different story. But if you just look at how Sydney Metro operates, this is the way how a high capacity metro would operate anywhere in the world. So you can go to Singapore and the metro trains will operate exactly like this, just at higher frequencies. And one characteristic of this operation is that every train stops at every station. Why? Because the task of a metro system is to connect suburbs. If trains don't stop at suburb stations, then there's no connection. So if you really have every train stopping at every station, not only you improving the connectivity of those suburbs, providing a better service to passengers at those stations, not just every second train is stopping there, but every train is stopping there. And you also benefit your reliability of your operation by having a more consistent timetable and more consistent stopping patterns of trains that follow each other. Is that what would you say about this?
I'd agree with that. A uniform pattern, including stopping all stations, is clearly likely to underpin the highest utilisation of track capacity and goes with reliability. Historically, though, and Melbourne's a very monocentric city. What I mean by that is all rail lines virtually lead to the city, and a high proportion of workers work in our central business district.
Yeah.
And for those workers, quite a few want to take the trains to the city because it's either faster in many cases or less stressful than driving or cheaper than driving to the city. So historically, though, a lot of people on the outer parts of the city wanted to get there faster than stopping all stations. So there's this continuous trade-off, which again has been wrestled with politicians and promises over decades about stopping everywhere versus the speed of getting to the city. But ultimately, as you get to the higher proportion of track utilisation, I'm talking about assessments of we're using the track to 70 or 80%, you catch up to the train in front anyway. So you can play with mixed patterns and block stop patterns and all that sort of stuff. But inevitably, you end up pretty much stopping all stations with one train. And then if you don't stop the one behind it, it's going to catch up anyway. And we spoke about the V-line train. So they're very subject to that. There's effectively two tracks all the way from Pakenham, which will soon be Pakenham East, because Level Crossing are actually building another station to help with the design around Pakenham. And that'll be commissioned again, I think, next year. So V-line have to enter the suburban network and effectively share the same tracks today through past Richmond to Flinders Street. And even when Metro Tunnel is commissioned, they'll still be sharing the same tracks from effectively Pakenham East right through to the Eastern Portal, which is just prior to South Yarra. So there's a long shared track. So what that effectively means is the V-Line train, although it is not designed and it's not its role to stop and pick up at all suburban stations, it's effectively coasting along at a slow-ish speed because it's got to work in with the suburban train, which when it stops, basically has an average speed of somewhere around 37 kilometres an hour from Dandenong into the city. So the V-Line train's effectively coasting behind that. Unless separate tracks are built, then that's the nature of the operation that the V-Line trains from Traralgon and Bairnsdale will be operating between.
Yeah, I mean I've got a view on this, which is probably very unpopular with people from the outer suburbs. But we had this discussion in Perth previously, where we don't have a mix. Well, there's some limited mix of regional trains and metropolitan trains or suburban trains, but even on lines which are purely operated by suburban trains, for example, our north-south line, which is the busiest of the entire network. There was a debate whether some trains should run express or at least semi-express, skipping a few stations. And I looked at this from the perspective of a coherent timetable and operational reliability and stuff like that. And I said, well, look, people buy houses in the outer suburbs. Why? Because it's normally cheaper out there, or it's nicer out there. I don't know, being closer to the beach or whatever it is. But how can they then have an ambition to get to the city faster than the people living closer to the city and paying more for their houses? That, to me, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, if I think I need to live far away from the city center, then having a longer commute is, in my world, an inevitable consequence. So if I have a train service that takes longer to get in the city than a train service from somewhere much closer to the city, I think it's logic. So there shouldn't be an entitlement for people living far out to be in the city faster than people living closer to the city, I think. Now, the other thing, and that's probably where the problem is, if there used to be express services in the past, and now suddenly you start getting away with those express services because the traffic gets denser, you need to run more trains. The regional services that previously got caught only occasionally are now much more likely to get caught behind an all-stopper. So the service quality or the journey times of the V-Line trains into Melbourne will probably come down, deteriorate, the higher the capacity on the line and the more all-stoppers you want to run on the line. So that I think is the issue for passengers, that they say, well, my service used to be better before than it is now. But at the same time, I think it's getting more logical. It's getting more just, more fair almost, where you say, okay, well, I live further away from the city, so it takes me longer to get into the city. That's just the way it is, right?
I think potentially COVID and work from home has probably seen people that are further out from the city, Doc Frank, keener to do more days at home, because commute was a fair proportion of their day.
Yeah.
Not uncommon for people on the outskirts of Melbourne. I'm talking about, Pakenham and Belgrave and Croydon and Lilydale and Craigieburn to be spending the best part of, an hour one way, and then sometimes even longer, depending on, modal connections and where they are with their office and their house relative to stations. But another thing that the regions, I'm talking about the V-Line key centres of Geelong and Warragul, Traralgon, Seymour, Ballarat and Bendigo have potentially all suffered from, is that Melbourne's got bigger. And what's come with that has actually been line extensions. So the electrified network has been extended. In my time alone, it's been extended from St Albans to Water Gardens, also known as Sydenham, and then out to Sunbury. So twice extended in that direction. It's been extended from Broadmeadows through to Craigieburn, with further discussions about whether it'll be extended to Donnybrook or Wallan. It's been extended, as I've spoken about, or it is in the process of being extended from Pakenham to Pakenham and the East. And there's certainly been a lot of housing growth at Pakenham. So in combination with line extensions, it's extended the suburban network. You've had additional services provided to the outer parts of Melbourne. So those two things combined means there's simply not a shorter pathways for V-Line to operate by themselves. And there's been more trains at the outer parts of the network.
Yes.
So without track separation, and I can't necessarily, I'm not here to make a case, and I'm not a transport economist to make a case for segregated tracks for V-Line services, or you could take a different view and have segregated tracks for people out from Pakenham to Dandenong and Cranbourne or Clyde to Dandenong, to really speed up the journey time by passing inner area, shorter operating train line or service pattern from, say, a Dandenong or a Springvale. So without that, they are long trips, and it does seem quite ironic that one of the early projects that I was involved in was actually regional fast rail. This is a decade and a half before regional rail link. Regional fast rail introduced 160k track operation in the regions. It also included a scope upgrade to have the velocity trains, which were originally specified as 130 kilometres, re-specified and contracted up to 160 kilometre operation. So when I spoke about the V-Line trains getting tracked behind suburban trains that are operating around 35 to 40 kilometres, depending on which suburban line, they've actually come from territories where sometimes they're doing 160 kilometres an hour. So it's quite a contrast to have high-speed operation in the areas where track utilisation is quite low, but then into suburban networks and operate for quite a period of time at such a differential speed.
Yes and no. But I think that, again, it comes back to the expectations what people have, and also to the entitlements what people have. I mean, you come into Melbourne by car, and you come from places like, I don't know, Ballarat, Bendigo or so. You're using one of these new super modern expanded motorways, and you can travel at 110. Nobody would expect to be able to travel 110 in the city center of Melbourne. So you're reaching, say, the Melbourne Ring Road, and speed is reduced down to 80. And then you're traveling still on a freeway, say the Tulla Freeway, for example, you travel into town at 80. You leave the freeway, and then the speed is down to 60. And then you come into the inner city, and then there may be a low speed area where you can only get, 40 or 30, or you hit a school zone, and then it's a completely different thing. So from a road perspective, if you think about it, it makes perfect sense that you can have high speed on the outer suburbs, basically through the open fields. And once you come closer to the metropolitan areas, the speeds will have to come down and travel gets slower. So why would that be so different on a rail service? Yeah, so I think one of the trying to find a solution here, which is basically a solution for making it more digestible for passengers, those changes that are coming, is to basically focus on the positives and not so much on, my service was 5 minutes faster like 10 years ago than it is today. So, I mean, what would be the alternative? The alternative would be for a regional train from the southeast to terminate at Pakenham. Have everybody off the train, regional train stops there and then goes back to Traralgon or Bairnsdale. So everybody gets off the train, everybody gets on a metropolitan train, on a suburban train, and then going all stops into Melbourne. Is that a better option? Most passengers will probably say no, because on the regional train, I've got my seat. I may even have my USB plug-in or my Wi-Fi, so I can keep working. I can keep reading a book. I don't want to change trains. I don't want to have to change trains if I can stay on this train all the way into Southern Cross. Thank you very much. So there we go. Yeah. So if this is your preference, then just sit there, enjoy your book, enjoy your podcast, and just live with the fact that it takes 5 minutes longer because, hey, Melbourne is growing. It's not the same city as it used to be 10 years ago, which has an upside as well. Employment opportunities may become better and so on. So yeah, there is some kind of downside. Yeah, you can't walk through the city center with your arms stretched out, even though you could do that 10 years ago. Now, if you did it now, you would probably hit 25 people in the face within the first 5 seconds. So you can't do that. So that's another thing that just changes the fuller, the more populated the city becomes. Yeah, but I think it's not enough emphasis put on. How do I explain this to passengers? How can I do what needs to be done in order to raise the capacity of the entire network? And how do I sell it to the public? Yeah, more trains more often. Well, that's fantastic, but not for the regional passengers. They have no benefits from more trains more often, quite the contrary. Services are getting worse the more trains you have running more often, because that's related to the suburban trains. And I mean, this is what it is. If you are on a regional train which enters the suburban network and then travels on the suburban network, yeah, well, you need to adjust your travel speed, your journey times, your stopping patterns, everything. You need to align this with the suburban network. That's just what it is. But I don't think that's clear enough to passengers, and maybe it's not communicated clear enough to passengers, where people say, well, yeah, as I said earlier, for the car, it's a no-brainer. For a car, everybody understands that they can go 110 on the outer freeway, but they can only go 80 on the ring road, and they could only, but I mean, nobody would want to go 110 on the ring road because you would have an accident within 5 minutes. Yeah. So
with that ring road, Doc Frank, I think it's interesting to think about the ring rail. So there's been a lot of controversial comments on ring rail, primarily because the suburban rail loop I'm talking about proposed to be, at this stage at least, SRL East from Cheltenham Precinct to Box Hill, all underground. But potentially what it does is distributes employment and intensifies housing density, which is really quite important, because if you talk about Melbourne is still bigger to the east and southeast than it is to the west, but that is rebalancing itself. But if employment really does shift out to Clayton and Dandenong and these sort of locations, and even Pakenham, it does make it much more viable to have trips to get from, Warragul to Pakenham or Clayton. And it's that last, 20 kilometres into the city that is that slower journey. But it's also where, at the moment, the most congestion occurs on suburban trains in particular. So if employment can shift out, and again, Melbourne's a lot more monocentric than virtually every other city, including Sydney, which has its business centres, obviously North Sydney, but Parramatta and Chatswood and Macquarie Park and Norwest and Hurstville are all quite busy centres. Bankstown, Liverpool, goes on. Yep. Melbourne doesn't quite have that. So yes, there's likely to be growth in, Sunshines and Dandenongs, but I think SRL in particular will really underpin huge growth in business parks like Clayton. Box Hill will continue to intensify, Cheltenham. So it potentially rebalances the jobs, which in my time in the railway, the growth has probably originally been South Bank, and now it's been Docklands. But again, Docklands is an interesting concept about where is Docklands and how's it really serviced by public transport, because Southern Cross Station has now become virtually as busy as Flinders Street Station because of the continuous growth of Docklands. But some people get out of Southern Cross Station and they still get a 25-minute walk to get to their office, because the western part of Docklands is not exactly at Southern Cross Station. So they can take a light rail tram. But again, where is the network going to evolve to And there's certainly one of the key things with rail planning, especially new lines, is the suburb use. There's been lots of discussion about how Melbourne Tunnel project might result in reusage around the Arden precinct, where there's a lot of old factories and low density. There's been a lot of discussion on, what's the right solution for Fisherman's Bend and the inner part of Port Melbourne. Not the glamorous beachy part with the lovely promenade, with people with the high rise that like their views. I'm talking about the inner part of Port Melbourne. Ultimately, the success of those suburbs, the usage of business and high density apartments is really driven on the success of a transport solution, because no one wants to move to a gridlock transport precinct where you're virtually locked into car usage only, and immediately during peak hours, a really slow, frustrating, slow car trip because the road network's not even that strong or as difficult. I mean, ultimately, if a project like Melbourne Metro 2, MM2, was to go ahead, and that project conceptually is linking up the Clifton Hill precinct, what we call the Clifton Hill group, the lines out to Mernda and Hurstbridge. If that was to go ahead, take a new route under the city, go under Fisherman's Bend, go under the river and come up around Newport, that could provide a solution to get from Fisherman's Bend, Port Melbourne into the city in between 5 and 10 minutes. That's very different from the time you take on the light rail, the one light rail that does go down to Port Melbourne, or getting to the city from that precinct by car. And again, when you come in by car, you've also got to find a car park. More and more the city, as it probably should be, is rebalanced back to it's for light rail. The pedestrianisation should really be supported. Not that you should push cars out, but they shouldn't be a predominant way to get into the city, because ultimately the city suffers if it has congested roads and everyone's trying to reverse park, etc. in a precinct where you've got, cafes, dining, etc.
Yeah.
So rail strategic use, I'd like to see it wedded in better with land use, because I think we've been developer centric in Victoria for a long time. Developers want their green areas. It's easy to have to fight with existing councils about intensifying housing. There's nice green paddocks, but you can end up with quite transport poor solutions out there, and we're never going to get a metro that stretches as far out as the current boundary, let alone the boundary where Melbourne might continue to be extended. So one of the references I like to refer to, Doc Frank, is that Melbourne's indicatively the size of Paris, and Paris has 4 times the amount of people. And London, I think, has successfully not increased its land use boundary for close to 50 years. Now, there are pockets in Melbourne that can definitely be used, but inevitably, we can either continue to be a detached house and land predominant growth city, or we have to intensify. Yes, I get it. Not everyone wants to live in apartments, but I think apartments have to change to be more favourable to families.
Yes.
Definitely centred around places where there's lots of facilities, not just transport, but good schools, good medical facilities, theatres, etc. But conversely, I go to somewhere like Tokyo and I love it. It's just stuff at your fingertips within 5 minutes, and you can certainly get from A to B using the metro or the above ground train system or the extensive bus network very quickly once you get used to it. It is very customer friendly, and it's sort of the mode of choice. Melbourne, Sydney and Victoria, you're not going to shift across to that overnight, but it's very important to progressively move the public transport system in a way that will make future generations want to use it and consider it a good way to get to the network. At the moment, there is a tremendous amount of disruption, and credit to the government, they're doing something fantastic, which is removing level crossings. Now, I'd love to see the shift back to increasing frequency, with the added benefit that when you do that on some of the lines, long lines, you're no longer dramatically impacting the road network by having level crossings down for much more extended times.
Yeah.
So, Frankston had 29 level crossings, Pakenham and Cranbourne around 31. Most of those, in fact, all those are proposed to go prior to the end of this decade. What I'd love to see is the upgrading service. So virtually these lines, all the time, you go there and there's a 10-minute service. So if you've just missed a train because you don't look at your timetable, you don't even have to look at your app. You go, okay, I'll wait 8 minutes. You don't turn up to the station just having missed it because your bus was late or you were getting a car park and you see you're waiting for 28 minutes.
Yes.
Or in some cases, even, 40-minute service or even hourly services out to Melton and other places. So, I'm quite passionate about working with authorities, projects, departments, about shifting that thinking forward because a lot of it is actually, it is recurrent funding. Sometimes it doesn't need new projects. I'm not saying these new projects aren't good. What I'm saying is that there's a lot of room for improvement in some of the off-peak periods, the late night periods, the weekend periods. So perhaps the thing I'm most proud of in my career is leading a team that not only implemented but pushed the department at the time to introduce 10-minute weekend services Saturday and Sunday during daylight hours on the Dandenong line, doubling the 20-minute service to Pakenham and Cranbourne, which was previously 40, out to Ringwood and Lilydale and Belgrave, moving up to a 20-minute service. And for Frankston line, a 10-minute service all the way, all day, because there isn't a branch on the Frankston line like the other corridors. So that became a 20-minute service overnight to a 10-minute service. Now, my view prior to that was what we were saying to people is don't turn up to Caulfield or Camberwell, with your pram or with a family. It's not going to be a pleasant experience. The train is going to be that busy that you are going to be, face-to-face, crushed in the door load, especially when things like football are on. And Melbourne's a big event centre. Football and Royal Melbourne shows and cricket and all these things, concerts, basically meant that the experience you're likely to get on public transport at the time at 11 o'clock on a Saturday or 4 p.m. coming home and you're just having to coincide with a football game, returning traffic, was not likely to be pleasant. So to change that from 20 minutes to 10 minutes certainly meant that you're more likely to get seats. You weren't going to wait at the station. If there was a late train, you weren't going to be waiting 23 minutes. So that was a big change. I'd love to see that rolled out to other lines. Lines like Craigieburn line, Sunbury line, some of these other lines, even the Sandringham line is underestimated often in the industry about how busy it actually is. There's been some definite intensification of housing on the northern part of the Sandringham line. I think it's time that should be a focus, and I'd encourage the major parties of all persuasion to introduce that, because I don't come across too many people that don't wish their train service or their bus that gets them to the train network wasn't a bit more frequent. It's clearly, I think, a vote winner and would coincide with the major projects that have been put forward by the government of the last decade and beyond, but also to coincide with the removal of level crossings that no longer has the impact on the road system because a lot of the major level crossings are now gone.
It sounds to me, what you just said, it sounds to me that there are a few relatively low-hanging fruits where benefits for passengers can be achieved without spending too much money about it. I mean, you mentioned earlier the suburban rail loop. I think from a network perspective for Melbourne, that's exactly what the city needs. But quite honestly, what hurts me most about suburban rail loop, and I spent a while in Werribee, which is supposed to be the western end of the suburban rail loop in its eventual expansion, that this is going to need, I don't know, another 30 years, if not more, until the line will ever show up there. And maybe 20 years, if not more, to reach all the way to Tullamarine Airport. This is really what hurts. You look at the line, you look at what it would do to the network, and the only thing you would wish is you have it in 5 years and not in 25 or 35 or something like that. So I think something's interesting happening in Sydney at the moment, which hopefully will be a blueprint or a almost like a benchmark for other metro projects in Australia. Sydney Metro is just kicking off a new line in the outer west of Sydney, going from St. Mary's to the new Western Sydney Airport. And what they're doing on this line, I believe, is to go for a lighter touch. So they're doing something which is called light metro in other parts of the world, which means you have shorter trains, you are trains which are not as heavy, and you can get the necessary capacity by running those trains more often. What shorter trains can give you and lighter trains can give you is enormous savings in the entire infrastructure around it. Yeah, just alone, if an underground station, every underground station can be kept only half as long or only a third as long as your stations which are planned out for 10-car trains or something like this. You only have 3-car trains. So you can make the stations much shorter, which means you save a lot of money. The axle load on the tracks is not as high as you would have for a heavy metro, which saves a lot of money in the whole tunneling, in the whole setup of the railway tracks and so on. So you can probably realize and implement a metro line at much lower cost compared to what you're currently building at the metro tunnel, for example, where you start off with 7-car trains. You have already the provisions to expand the trains to 10-car trains in the future. And then you basically have a big, huge station with very long platforms that end up being half empty for years and years and years because the trains are much shorter than the actual platform lengths. So going the other way around and finding a way how to build those projects at lower cost and faster, I think it's a way forward. You mentioned Fisherman's Bend, so this whole concept of Metro Tunnel 2, which has been around for a while. I'm not sure whether you see this coming and when. I can't see it. I mean, at the moment, the government is cutting things short. They're stopping Melbourne Airport Rail. They're stopping Geelong Fast Rail. The suburban rail loop, they're only talking about phase 1. Nobody knows whenever phase 2 and 3 will come up. So bringing in an additional mega projects like Metro Tunnel 2 at this point in time, I can't imagine how that should work, unless you come up with a scheme that allows the building of those projects at a much lower cost point.
I think in that area, Dr. Frank, the market in Australia is growing insofar as the market that can build and supply the sort of stuff that railway projects need, share with road. I've got no doubt the tunnel boring machine industry is much, much bigger, and all sorts of tricks about reusing them or leaving them underground. But one thing, not commission a project, then putting in mothballs, working out what the logical sequence of projects actually is. And of course, Victoria, New South Wales and Queensland, forming the key states on the eastern seaboard, don't necessarily line up about when they're starting projects. So what you can get is a really hot market at a particular point in time between road and rail sharing resources. No doubt alone in the signalling world of railway, there's peaks and troughs of projects. And sometimes resources are in huge demand because these projects overlap. So you're potentially not needed at the very start of the project, you're not needed at the end, but in the middle part of projects, you need it in detail. And if you have multiple major projects at the same time, it only takes one discipline, whether it's railway signalling or overhead designers or track designers or to a lesser extent modelers. There's a lot of resources being sought by some major projects. So that lack of a key master plan that does put out, what projects will be done in what order, and ideally, potentially more opportunity for sharing of knowledge between jurisdictions in Australia, both in terms of, who's doing what projects and what we can learn from each other, but also, sharing thinking or even purchase orders. So for an individual metro line, a train order of potentially only, 10 to 15 trains isn't that exciting for the railway market. Now, there are challenges because we've got different gauges within Australia. But that's not to say that creative approaches couldn't be taken to look at metro systems that have been set up in different jurisdictions and potentially optimize purchase orders with some key variations subject to each market to get some efficiencies from the market supplying key resources to a project or to a rail system, be it a train or be it shared usage of tunnel boring machines, etc. More and more, I'd like to learn some of the lessons from what's been done successfully in Sydney. And when I was on Suburban Rail Loop, we certainly did some of that. Whereas setting up defined networks where we could share information, subject to confidentialities, of course, but let's not make mistakes in the industry where others have taken smart decisions or introduced technologies appropriately. Just because you've got a new technology doesn't mean you should, make that decision. You've got to, again, work out what are you trying to do with your rail system or your rail line or your light rail or your freight system, and how do we blend in design decisions, technology, work practices, etc. And ideally deliver these projects in an efficient manner. Of course, railway safety is always important, but let's not over-engineer. Let's not gold plate. By the same token, let's not be that myopic that we make a decision that 5 years later we've got to undo or revise a key bit of infrastructure because we simply hadn't planned far enough and ahead and we only thought of a very short-term outcome, and now the network's blocked 5 or 10 years later because the resources are going to be reapplied to undoing or adding to something, and that's going to cost the state a lot more in the end if they haven't got a plan that's appropriately future-proofed. Yeah. So again, the clarity around where will there be, 3 tracks or 4 tracks? What is an appropriate terminal design for what this network may need in 10 or 15 years? And again, getting back to the rail system in particular, because I talk about rail system more than the bus or light rail because I've worked in it more, but also it's the key backbone. In Melbourne in particular, the bus network feeds the rail system a fair bit. In Sydney, it offers some pretty dense routes from parts of Sydney that aren't serviced by rail. But again, in both cases, the rail network's the real backbone, and it really links land usage to movement between house and job. And it's so important for the vibrancy of the city precincts. And for Melbourne's really lucky because it's got a sport precinct that's very well serviced by rail. But again, some of the late finishes or unanticipated crowds sometimes fall into windows where the service frequency isn't, in my view, quite ideal, leading to some really congested platforms at Richmond or Jolimont or Southern Cross with Marvel Stadium. So a lot of that, a more frequent rail network would continuously provide people a better outcome, encourage them to take that mode of choice, and when there's disruption or late running, continue to operate a more supportive service. Because ultimately, be it at Richmond or be it at Southern Cross, sometimes people have more than one train choice to get to their next location. So you might want to go from Southern Cross to Footscray or from Richmond to Caulfield. There's more than one train line that does that. Yeah. So again, getting back to frequency and what a sound network can do is support events, support logical land use. Even some of it returns back to government, because if Fisherman's Bend or Arden is successful, then land use stamp duty goes up because people are getting more value from their land because there's transport solutions there for them when they move there. And most people like to be in suburbs or environments where they have the choice. And it may not be, they might like to drive, may never take a rail system, but often they like their teenage kids or whatnot to be able to get somewhere. Otherwise, they've got to taxi them around in their cars.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's so many things I could talk about there and which basically triggers some reactions and some thoughts. The only problem I see is like our time usage. So we are well above the 1 hour that we normally have at the upper limit of these podcast interviews. So I think I still have a list of topics to go with you, which we haven't even touched on. So I would definitely be keen to have a follow-up with you in the near future, if that's okay with you. Because, I mean, just alone this whole thing of traffic planning ideas, I mean, it's not up to you and me to do the travel planning for Melbourne, but at the same time, it seems that we have a lot of quite logical, commonsensical ideas that might be quite practical. So and I guess it's not just the Melbourne podcast, obviously, but I guess people from other cities listening to that, they may transfer this over to the situation in their own city, and they say, well, what these guys are talking about for Melbourne is actually something that might also work in, I don't know, in Brisbane or somewhere overseas or so. So I think that's really an interesting discussion that I would really like to continue with you, also in this kind of forum here that's of benefit to the listeners of the podcast.
Sounds good. I'd be happy to come back and do another one at a later stage. I enjoyed our chat. And as you know, I can talk all day about transport and how it influences cities and the lifestyle that us Australians and residents here are used to and love.
Yeah. Yes. And from with regards to standardization between cities, I think it's extremely important to look at what other cities are doing, and sometimes the trick is really to understand what other cities are doing. So, for example, if somebody asks me the question, who is good in precinct development, because that's something we want to do in Melbourne, well, inside Australia, I would send them to Sydney Metro, because I think they're doing an increasingly good job of doing just that, like precinct development around the metro stations. And outside Australia, I would point to Hong Kong. And again, you've got an immediate link into Melbourne, because your operator here in Melbourne, MTM, is partly MTR Hong Kong. So there must be an organizational link that can tap into the knowledge of precinct development in Hong Kong, asking the question, well, is that something where we can share lessons learned, or is that something that may be exportable from Hong Kong into Melbourne or something like that? It's probably what Sydney Metro has done, or in a similar way or so. So having this kind of knowledge exchange in order to make decisions which are almost low-hanging fruit, which make a lot of sense and which may help railway projects to become more affordable because there's higher return. I think that's really the trick. Because I'm pretty sure you and I can come up with a number of projects for Melbourne alone that from a transport planning perspective would make a ton of sense, but where people say, well, we just don't have the money. Maybe we do something in 30, 40 years, but it's something that you need probably rather in 5 to 10 years than in 30 to 40, because by then Melbourne will be so huge that it's almost too late to do something decent about capacity. Thank you very much for your time. I found this conversation very, very inspiring, very exciting. And as I said, I'm looking very much forward to a follow-up in the near future. I promise the listeners it won't take too long to get you back on the show, provided that you can make time. And thank you again for making the time today, Craig. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Frank. I just have one more final thing to say in regard to Melbourne and Sydney. In the 4 years I went to live up in Sydney, I felt that Sydney was actually becoming more Melbourneised insofar as they introduced another AFL team. They introduced a lot more cafes and tried to make coffee as good as Melbourne. They actually introduced a lot of small bars. Sydney had been known for its big beer barns and high-cost alcohol licenses, and they saw what Melbourne was doing with its laneways. And fourthly, they introduced more light rail or trams. So all these things made me feel a little bit more like I was in Melbourne, but I was actually in Sydney. Unfortunately, on the return, I couldn't bring back Sydney's weather or Sydney's beaches back to Melbourne. But I love both cities, and I love my public transport. So thanks for the chat. Appreciate it greatly.
Thank you. And to all the listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did having it. As usual, it would be great if you could subscribe to the podcast and telling your friends about it, because I still have heard by means of rumor that not everybody in Australia, let alone in the world, knows about this podcast and how great it is for the railway industry. So I hope you can help spreading the word, and also check out some of the older episodes, which are all great. And as usual, at the end of the podcast, keep it simple and bye for now.
See you later.
Hi, this is Doc Frank from the studio. I want to inform you about my latest and greatest training development, and it is all about the mindset of a high-capacity railway organization. What I found in my experience of training and consulting is that often you have projects for new technology which seem to be perfectly planned, which are very well executed, and they still don't lead to the success that was expected. And very often the reason for that is mindset. Key stakeholders that have what I call a legacy mindset, and outdated old ways of thinking, where the new technology is treated in the same way as the old one, but it's just not suitable to get the most out of the new technology. What I'm offering in this training course, which is called High Capacity Railway Mindset, is that every month there's a new training module with 5 examples of an outdated legacy mindset, the suggestion of a new mindset more suitable for a high capacity railway, and how to get from the old to the new mindset. So those modules will be repeated every month for an entire year. So in total, we are talking about 60 different examples how to get from an old mindset to a more suitable new mindset. And the cost for this is only $10 per example. So this can be paid monthly, this can be paid for a year. And there is an early bird special where until the end of July, you're only paying for 10 months instead of 12. So you get 12, you only pay for 10. And then you have the usual service of an alumni community afterwards, where you can ask ongoing questions for at least 12 months after the training. You find more information and you can sign up on my training portal, docfranktraining.podia.com/mindset. I hope I see you at this training. It's really leading edge stuff. Nobody else in the world is training on this. And if you really want to explore the ultimate frontier of success in technology projects, then this is the training you need to take. I hope I see you there. And now let's get back to the podcast. Hey, Doc Frank here, host of the Railway Conversations podcast. Thank you for listening.